Hi there. Today we're going to establish the context, audience and purpose for William Wilberforce's speech, referred to as the Abolition Speech, which was delivered in 1789. You may like to complete your analysis table while you're watching the video about the context of the speech. So William Wilberforce is most remembered as the leader of the parliamentary campaign to abolish the slave trade. So after graduating from college, he was keen to develop a career in politics, and he also became very interested in religion and became a very committed Christian, which would have been part of his reasoning for fighting for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery of his time. At the time that Wilberforce lived, Britain was heavily involved in the slave trade, so it was a very prominent issue for him at the time. And it was during these years around the 1780s when his interest in humanitarian reform grew very strong, and he followed through with his interest of slave trade once he was introduced to the issue by a person who had been involved with the slave trade and had seen the conditions. It wasn't until a few years later, though, that William actually started his interest. He turned it down at first, because he was actually concerned, as it mentions here, about raising the issue in Parliament, because the slave trade was actually used quite heavily by fellow members of Parliament, and they had a lot of wealth invested in that slave trade. When he actually did bring it up in Parliament and started pushing for the abolition of the slave trade, he did actually make many enemies. Once he was then committed to that campaign. So the purpose of the speech and the audience is listed on the slide here. So it was first delivered by Wilberforce in 1789 to members of Parliament after months of planning. He didn't go with it straight away. He sort of had to plan it out first to make sure he approached it in the right way and had enough sort of support behind him to push this forward. So its main purpose, the speech itself, was delivered in Parliament, and its main purpose raised the topic of the abolition of the slave trade altogether. So getting rid of it altogether and making it official in Parliament that it was actually a law. So they didn't aim for the abolition of slavery altogether at first, as they felt that this would naturally occur if the slave trade became something that wasn't allowed anymore, and if it was abolished. So he delivered the speech in the House of Commons, so delivered it to the members of Parliament in the House of Commons, though Wilberforce's campaign included many other people, not just himself, and he also appealed to the public for support in order to back up what he was saying in Parliament. So he presented the abolition bill for many, many years, but it kept getting defeated, and it wasn't until later that it was finally passed, which is on the next slide here. So the outcome, it wasn't until 1807, so it took almost 20 years for the bill to be passed, but without the courage and determination of Wilberforce to make that initial abolition speech, which is the one we are looking at, in Parliament, the bill may have never been passed at all. So history could look quite different if it wasn't for someone like Wilberforce giving his speech in Parliament to have that bill passed. So the slave trade had been abolished, but not slavery itself. So it was illegal to buy and sell people, but you were still allowed to keep slaves and force them to work. So Wilberforce kept campaigning. He retired from Parliament, but he kept campaigning for the abolition of slavery altogether, and it wasn't until 1833 that this was passed. Wilberforce actually died 3 days after that bill was passed, after spending most of his life fighting illnesses whilst he was campaigning. So it was lucky for him that he actually got to see the outcome of what he had worked for most of his life. So with your context and knowledge in mind, you can do some further research if you wish. There is actually a film called Amazing Grace, which shows you the story of Wilberforce and his fight for this. But now that you know a little bit about it, you need to go and read the abolition speech. You have a copy of it in your booklet. So after reading it, you then need to try and identify the key devices that are listed here, as well as any others that you might find. Okay, this isn't necessarily all that's in there. So go to the list that's in your booklet and see what devices you can find that are used in the speech. Remember to annotate the devices and identify the devices, but also clarify unfamiliar vocab, and also to annotate parts and what they mean and what he's referring to. So bring this to class for your discussion among each other, and you can annotate as a class, and remember to do your analysis table as well.